Okay. And so now that we know militarily and politically we're involved in World War I, we've asked for the declaration of war from Congress because we know only Congress can do that. How does the war impact us at home? I mean, we're going to be split. You've seen our country divided. You've seen what issues divide us. You know, the war is going to divide us. Should we be there or should we not? And the United States is incredibly unique in that we have the Bill of Rights and freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And it's hard for us to put limits on those. Okay? So what you're being asked to do is to explain the domestic impact of World War I. How does it impact us here in the United States? We're going to talk about the Great Migration, the Espionage Act, and socialist Eugene Debs. So we will take a day of class and we'll look at how American citizens rationed and had their victory gardens and what they felt like they could do on the home front for their soldiers overseas. The war impacted us any way you could possibly imagine. Woodrow Wilson's administration organized the economy, though, to sell wartime bonds. A bond is something that it's a certificate the government sells. An American citizen gives the government money, holds onto this certificate for a few years, maybe 10 years, and then once that time is up, gives that certificate back to the government, and the government gives them their money back with interest. So, to finance the war, the United States government sold what was called Liberty bonds. Liberty, it's a form of, that propaganda. We want to fight for our freedom. So it's a way for you to pay for freedom. They sold Liberty bonds to American citizens. American citizens would then take these bonds. They felt like they were contributing to the war effort. And it was a way for them to allow the U.S. government to borrow their money for a little bit and pay for the war. Surprisingly enough, these bonds paid for about 2/3 of what the war cost. So if we hadn't sold these bonds, we probably wouldn't have been able to afford the war. Okay. Now, while we're fighting this war, we have to put some more limitations on our freedoms to ensure that that we can win this war. Okay, so President Woodrow Wilson tells the American public every person is going to pay the price of nonconformity. If you don't follow what they're telling us to do, then you'll pay for it with some type of consequence. The first piece of legislation that's imposed, or first law, is the Selective Service Act. This is called conscription. Okay, you should have learned that in world history. Okay, the Selective Service Act, or the SSA, requires that all adult males over the age of 21 to register for the draft. Doesn't mean you're going to war. It just means that your name can be pulled out of the hat to be put into the military to go to war. Because at that point in time, if we had just asked people to join, we wouldn't have had enough soldiers. The other piece of legislation passed is the Sedition Act. It just prohibits the use of any disloyal language. So people couldn't say anything that would make them look as though they weren't loyal or patriotic to the United States. Here's the kicker, though. The Espionage Act that was passed in 1917, and yes, World War I goes from 1914 to 1918. But we don't join right away, remember that. So in 1917, Congress passes the Espionage Act. It provides consequences for anybody who spies, sabotages, or obstructs the American war effort. If you're a convicted spy, according to the Espionage Act, that's treason. But it bans the use of United States mail to send out any anti-war materials as well. So even if you wanted to send a letter to somebody saying, I don't believe in the war, you couldn't do that. Okay? So this is where the American public is going to start fighting back. People in the United States desperately want to hang on to their civil liberties, especially the freedom of expression. Eugene Debs, who you see in this picture in the upper right-hand corner, was a prominent socialist. Really, he was a leader of a union. He was a candidate for president at one point in time. Okay. He gave a speech in Ohio against the war. Well, the United States government came and arrested him, and Debs claimed that it was violating his freedom of speech. So his case will eventually go to the Supreme Court over freedom of speech. And that's the Debs versus United States Supreme Court case. Charles Schenck is another one. Now, Eugene Debs, again, a socialist, very much in favor of the government, kind of, equality for all and whatnot. Didn't want to give up his right to freedom of speech, but he spoke out against the war, and that's what got him into trouble. Charles Schenck gets in trouble with the U.S. government because he sends out flyers in the mail telling young men, don't register for the draft. So that's a violation of the Espionage Act. The Supreme Court then will hear his case and will uphold the limits on freedom of speech, meaning they side with the government in that he wasn't allowed to do that. He violated the law. And that people are not allowed, that there are limits on our freedom of speech whenever there is a clear and present danger to the United States and the country as a whole. Basically, anytime we're at war. This case is incredibly important. It's Schenck versus the United States. And the reason this case, the Supreme Court case is so important is because it shows that the government can limit our rights and our civil liberties, especially during wartime. And you're probably not going to win that case. All right. Then there's the Great Migration. During this time on the home front, remember we talked about the Jim Crow laws in the South at the time of Reconstruction, after the Civil War. And they're basically legal policies that allowed the government to implement segregation. Okay? Well, we talked about sharecropping in the South and how detrimental that was to families. So families in the South fought to escape the sharecropping issue, and they fled to the North looking for jobs. The violence in the South against blacks grew and increased and became more and more violent. Okay? And during the war, all these manufacturing plants, remember we talked about how industry was located up in the North. They're going to increase manufacturing, and because they're trying to produce more wartime equipment, more weapons, more bullets, more ammunition for the troops overseas. So there's more jobs in the North anyway. So a lot of the people in the South are going to flee to the North. And with all the soldiers going off to war, a lot of jobs are freed up too. So let me give you an example. Over 1.5 million blacks from the South moved to northern cities. Now, Chicago's population is going to increase by over 140%. Cleveland's population is going to grow by 300%. And Detroit's black populations grow by 600%. It's a great migration or a great movement of people from the South to the North.